1st of September 1939, Germany and her ally, Soviet Russia, invaded Poland. Britain was the guarantor of Poland's neutrality, and having had no response from Adolf Hitler to its ultimatums for withdrawal, was left with no alternative but to enter into a conflict for which it was underprepared. Tensions had been rising in Europe since Hitler's assumption of power in Germany in 1933. He ordered the rebuilding of Germany's armed forces, even though this went against what had been agreed during the armistice negotiations signed in 1919. The First World War was supposed to have been the war to end all wars, a war in which technology had changed the nature of conflict. The rifleman and cavalry officer now had to make way for the tank. At sea, even the mightiest battleship was no match for the silent, deadly submarine that lurked unseen below the surface. Also, both army and naval services had to make way for a new kind of fighting in the third dimension, air power. Britain had played a major part in introducing these new technologies, but in the years after the war, complacency and underinvestment had set in. When it was realized by the mid-1930s that another war was almost inevitable, Britain was left in a race against time to make up the lost ground. By the outbreak of war, the process of re-equipping was well underway, but it would be a close-run thing if Britain could survive the first years of the war. Britain's other great challenge was the lack of manpower. Unlike her European neighbours, Britain did not have conscription, and so her armed forces were small by comparison. But having an empire meant that Britain was well supported by countries all over the world. In the battles to come, Britain came to rely heavily on forces sent by her Commonwealth allies on land, sea, and air. By the end of September, Poland had been crushed. The Western allies, led by Britain and France, assumed that it would be their turn next. But the Germans needed to regroup and work out their plan of attack. It led to a 7-month pause, now known as the Phony War. This break was invaluable to the British, who used the time to improve their training and continue re-equipping. It was assumed that the Germans would attack through Belgium, and so this is where the main strength of Britain's expeditionary force was deployed. Other divisions were sent to take up positions with the French along the Maginot Line on the German border. On May the 10th, 1940, the long-awaited German blow finally struck. Spearheaded by airborne landings at key points, the panzers moved quickly into Belgium and Holland. Despite putting up fierce resistance, the Dutch were quickly overwhelmed and forced to surrender after just 5 days. The BEF moved to block the German advance, and by the 14th, advanced units were reporting their first contacts with the enemy. But the attack through Belgium and Holland was not the main attack. Contrary to what had been believed, the main force was gathering in the Ardennes. The French had left this area unprotected, as it was assumed that the hilly and densely wooded terrain would be unsuitable for tanks to get through. But they were wrong, and when this force, which included over 40,000 armoured vehicles, began to advance, the French forces that confronted them were soon crushed. Once across the Meuse River, the Germans swung northwest, threatening to cut off the BEF. There was no alternative but for the British to withdraw south. Their movement was hampered by thousands of refugees blocking the roads. This was a deliberate ploy by the Germans, who would first bomb the towns and villages in order to get the civilians out of their homes. Once out in the open, the straggling columns would be attacked by fighters in order to drive them into the British columns travelling in the opposite direction. On May the 21st at Arras, British armour caught the Germans by surprise and nearly succeeded in cutting their supply lines, but the Germans quickly recovered, and British armour, left without support, was forced to withdraw. The attack at Arras made the Germans more cautious, and the rate of their advance slowed. It bought the Allies valuable time, as they now began regrouping. By May the 26th, they were trapped in a pocket at the Channel port of Dunkirk, with German forces on three sides and their backs to the sea. Operation Dynamo was launched to try and rescue as many men as possible. Vessels of every size left for the French coast, where they ran the risk of attack from the air. From May the 26th to June the 3rd, 200,000 British and 100,000 French troops were evacuated. It was an extraordinary operation that went a long way to ensuring that Britain could stay in the war. Equipment would be quickly replaced, but the experience gained by the men of the BEF would prove invaluable. They were to form the core of a new army, which would eventually be victorious in the deserts of North Africa, the jungles of Asia, and in Europe itself. By June 1940, Britain stood alone in the fight against the Nazis. Neville Chamberlain resigned as Prime Minister to be replaced by Winston Churchill. His obstinacy and refusal to give up was to provide the inspiration that Britain needed at this perilous moment in her long history. But even as the Germans celebrated their victory in France, Hitler was by no means committed to an invasion. He admired the British for their empire, but also viewed them as bungling idiots. His intermediaries in Switzerland and Sweden took soundings to see if some kind of armistice might be possible. Churchill, however, would have none of it. But Hitler's hesitation bought valuable time. If the Germans were to mount an invasion, then they would have to win air superiority first. Although the RAF had been unable to win control over the skies of Dunkirk, the Battle of France had cost the service dear. 959 aircraft had been lost, of which 509 were fighters, now desperately needed for home defence. In addition, 435 pilots had been killed, missing, or were now captured. By June, RAF Fighter Command was reduced to 331 Spitfires and Hurricanes for home defence. They would have to fight and defeat the swarms of Messerschmitt 109s, which was the German Luftwaffe's frontline aircraft. Britain's air defences had been well organised in the last year or two before the war. Integration was the key to its future success. A new technology called radar gave plotters the ability to detect intruders long before they reached the coast. Listening devices also helped in this first-line role. Observers then confirmed the actual numbers, type, and course of the force. All the information was fed into a central command, where plotters moved pieces around on a large map, giving commanders a view of the developing battle in almost real time. It provided them with the ability to scramble just the right numbers of aircraft in order to counter the threat. But resources were severely stretched, which meant that the pilots had to be on duty from before dawn until after dusk. It was exhausting work, as many flew up to 5 or 6 sorties a day. Aircraft production continued at a frantic pace to try and make up the losses. Production was dispersed all over Britain: garages, bakeries, laundries, even the Mersey Tunnel. The Spitfire was complicated to manufacture, with its elliptical wings and stressed metal skin construction. The Hurricane was much easier to build, as most of it was made of wood and fabric, like the biplanes that had preceded it. Fortunately, the Spitfire and Hurricane shared the same engine, the Rolls-Royce Merlin. As the Spitfire had better performance, it was tasked with attacking the Messerschmitt 109s. Both had advantages and disadvantages. The Spitfire could turn more tightly and was slightly faster below 15,000 feet. But the Messerschmitt had superior rate of climb and was marginally faster above 20,000 feet. Also, the Messerschmitt's Daimler-Benz engine used fuel injection, which meant that it could push a wider range of manoeuvres without the risk of fuel starvation. The Spitfire's Merlin engine had a float-type carburettor, which restricted manoeuvring, otherwise the engine would cut out due to fuel starvation. But the Messerschmitt's big disadvantage was a lack of endurance. By the time the bomber formations had formed up and made their slow progress to the English coast, the escorting fighters were running low on fuel, leaving them just a few minutes of combat time before they had to break off and head back to France. The Hurricanes were tasked with attacking the bombers. Its construction method meant that the Hurricane could take a lot more punishment than the Spitfire and still get its pilot home. The Battle of Britain's first phase began at the beginning of July. In an attempt to lure the RAF's fighters into the air, the Luftwaffe mounted a series of attacks against shipping in the English Channel. But Fighter Command was using its resources carefully and refused to respond except with the absolute minimum of force. Gradually, the Luftwaffe launched larger attacks all across southern England in order to try and bring the Spitfires and Hurricanes to battle. Phase 2 began with attacks against airfields and radar stations in early August. This was the most deadly phase, as without its radar and airfields, Fighter Command would be blind and unable to repair its aircraft. On August the 13th, the Luftwaffe launched Adlertag, or Eagle Day. This was to be the Luftwaffe's offensive aimed at destroying Fighter Command within 4 days. The RAF now faced its greatest challenge. The problem was that, although aircraft could be replaced, experienced pilots could not, and in this respect, Fighter Command was beginning to lose the battle. But on August the 15th, the Luftwaffe's commander, Hermann Göring, took the extraordinary decision to abandon attacks on radar stations in the belief that they were a waste of effort. It brought little respite, as the airfields were still under daily attack, but there were signs of a shift in the Luftwaffe's targets. Göring was now urging attacks against Bomber Command airfields. But by the beginning of September, Fighter Command was at the end of its tether. Exhaustion and losses were taking their toll. But the Germans too were facing up to their own crises. High Command had made too many promises that victory was just around the corner, and yet every day the Spitfires and Hurricanes were there to meet them. Then, in a moment of great good fortune, Göring ordered that British towns and cities should be the new targets in retaliation for a raid on Berlin flown by Bomber Command. It was just the break that Fighter Command needed in order to repair its airfields and regroup its squadrons. The battle of attrition now changed in favour of the RAF. With losses mounting, Hitler decided to abandon plans for an invasion. Although the London Blitz was unpleasant for the civilian population, it was of little military significance. Officially, the Battle of Britain ended on October 1st, 1940. It was the first battle of strategic significance to be won solely in the air. Churchill expressed the thanks of a grateful nation with the immortal words, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." Like the other two services, Britain's Royal Navy experienced mixed fortunes during the first year of war. But in November 1940, the Royal Navy was to carry out an attack that would fundamentally change the nature of sea power. By the summer of 1940, Italy had finally declared war on Britain. The fascist dictator Benito Mussolini had ambitions of building a new Roman Empire to rival that of Hitler's ill-gotten gains in Western Europe. Italy's powerful navy was given the task of winning control of the Mediterranean so that the countries that ringed it could be attacked by her land and air forces. But Britain was not about to give up her presence in Egypt without a fight. Compared with the Italian fleet, the Royal Navy's presence was quite small, but she had aircraft carriers. The Italian fleet refused to engage the Royal Navy in a set-piece battle, and so it was decided to attack the fleet whilst it was in harbour in Taranto. The Gulf of Taranto lies on the inside and at the top of the heel that makes up the shoe of southern Italy, and so would be a difficult target. The aircraft carriers Eagle and Illustrious were sent from Alexandria in Egypt with fairy Swordfish on board. The Swordfish was a biplane and was considered obsolete even when it entered service in 1936. But its slow speed made it an ideal platform for launching torpedoes into shallow waters like those off Taranto. On November the 11th, 1940, 21 Swordfish took off at dusk from the deck of Illustrious, as Eagle had had to return to Alexandria with problems. The attack was planned in 2 waves. Of the first strike of 12 Swordfish, 6 carried torpedoes, 4 carried bombs, and 2 carried a combination of bombs and flares. The 2 flare droppers put a line of flares over the harbour from 7,500 feet and then bombed an oil storage depot. The second wave of 5 aircraft armed with torpedoes, 2 armed with bombs and 2 armed with flares and bombs took off nearly an hour later after the first wave. Following their attack, the aircrews had to find their way back to the fleet, a journey of nearly 200 miles at night. All the aircraft, except 2 that had been shot down, were back on board Illustrious before 3 a.m. that morning. Aerial reconnaissance the following day revealed just how devastating the attack had been. 3 of the Italians' 6 capital ships had been put out of action. The Italians withdrew their fleet to the north, and although they would continue to harass the Mediterranean convoys, their fleet never recovered its former strength, its operations hindered by a sense of their own vulnerability to air attack. An unfortunate consequence of Taranto was that it proved to the Japanese that such an attack was viable, that they could use their considerable carrier force in the same way. On December the 4th, 1941, the fleet arrived off Hawaii. Waves of aircraft were launched, their target, the US Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor. In December 1941, the United States entered the war. Britain and her Commonwealth allies would no longer have to fight on their own. What's more, with the industrial might of the United States now turned to war production, the tide would surely turn. But it would be many months before there would be any sign of change. In the meantime, Britain would have to continue the fight as before. RAF Bomber Command had taken the fight to Germany from the very beginning of the war, but by 1942, there were many who were beginning to question whether the campaign was ever going to achieve anything worthwhile. In February 1942, Air Marshal Sir Arthur Harris was appointed to take over Bomber Command.
They sowed the wind, and now they are going to reap the whirlwind.
Harris was determined to see Bomber Command make its impact on the war effort, and so in the spring of 1942, a plan to launch an attack with 1,000 bombers, the 1,000 Plan as it was called, began to take shape. 1,000 aircraft in the sky at one time would send a powerful message to the enemy. As well as the physical destruction so many aircraft could cause, was the sobering thought that Britain was not only far from beaten, but that she still had the resources to launch 1,000 bombers, something that had never been done before. Every bomber that could fly was prepared for action. Even aircraft and crews from operational training units were thrown into what was, after all, an enormous gamble. Failure would mean the end of Bomber Command, and the end, or at least a dramatic scaling down, of the strategic bombing campaign against Germany. The target was to be Hamburg, and as detailed planning began, new tactics were evolved. The aircraft were to fly in a carefully regulated stream, taking a common route to and from the target, as well as flying at set speed. This was made easier by the recent introduction of G, which made it easier for crews to fly within such precise limits. Each aircraft was allocated a time and height at which it could enter the stream to minimize the risk of collisions. The aim was to get all the aircraft over the target within 90 minutes. At first, this had been considered by some to be all but impossible. At the beginning of the war, it had been considered an achievement to get 100 bombers over their target in a 4-hour period. By May the 26th, everything was ready. But bad weather set in over Hamburg, and the launch had to be delayed. For 3 days, the crews waited. Training schedules were now beginning to be seriously disrupted. It was a case of go now or not at all. At the last moment, Harris switched the target to Cologne, Germany's third largest city. The first wave was led by Vickers Wellingtons and Short Stirlings. Operation Millennium, as it was called, had begun. They were to be joined by everything that Bomber Command could lay its hands on: Hampdens, Whitleys, Manchesters and Halifaxes, as well as a few Avro Lancasters, which had only been in service since March. Incendiaries were dropped in the first waves, igniting fires that helped guide the later aircraft. They then dropped high explosive that blew buildings apart. The city's defences and rescue services were completely overwhelmed by the intensity of the attack. Some 41 aircraft were lost, which was the highest number lost in one raid up to that point. But as a percentage of the overall size of the force, it represented an acceptable rate. The 1,000 plan saved Bomber Command, and much of what was planned for that attack became the template for future raids. And although more large attacks were launched throughout the rest of the summer of 1942, none quite matched the size of Cologne. Also, the drain on resources was so great that they were progressively scaled down. The arrival of the United States 8th Air Force also helped reduce the pressure on Bomber Command, as the Americans began attacking Germany by day, whilst the RAF kept up its attacks by night. In 1941, Britain's war effort was in danger of grinding to a halt due to a shortage of raw materials and food. The flow of supplies from the United States was often disrupted due to attacks by German submarines. The problem was made worse after the fall of France, as this provided the U-boats with ports in western France, shortening their route into the Atlantic. The area that offered the U-boats the richest pickings became known as the Atlantic Gap. This was the center of the North Atlantic, where escorts from America had to leave the convoys, but the escorts from Britain had not yet joined. The U-boats reaped a vast harvest of merchant ships, even sailing within a few miles of the United States coast in order to launch further attacks. In the year of 1940 alone, more than 1,000 ships were sunk, a total of 4 million tons. Not only was Britain losing merchant ships, the battle was also depleting the Navy's destroyers and corvettes. By good fortune, a U-boat was captured with a machine for deciphering codes still intact. Cracking the German Navy's codes helped break the stranglehold. Now the Navy knew where the U-boats were going to be and could attack. Also, aircraft with longer endurance began to patrol the vast stretches of the North Atlantic. but it was still not enough. By the end of 1942, there were more U-boats operating in the Atlantic than ever before. And as if the U-boat menace were not enough, the convoys also had to run the gauntlet of Germany's powerful surface raiders. Two ships in particular tied up valuable naval and RAF resources, the Bismarck and her sister ship, Tirpitz. On the morning of the 24th of May, 1941, the British public woke to hear terrible news. HMS Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy and the largest ship in the fleet, had been sunk by the Bismarck, with almost all hands lost. In the same engagement, the new battleship Prince of Wales had been badly damaged. Bismarck was barely a year old, having been commissioned in 1940. Armed with 8 15-inch guns, a multitude of smaller guns, and a top speed of 30 knots, the Germans considered her unsinkable. But she had to be stopped. Contact with the Bismarck and the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen was soon established, and an attack was mounted using swordfish off the carrier Victorious. But they failed to stop the Bismarck, and she managed to give her pursuers the slip. 2 days of intensive search by aircraft and the powerful radar on the British cruisers failed to find her. Then, in a fatal error of judgment, Admiral Lutyens on board Bismarck spent half an hour in conference with Hitler. It was that enabled the British to pinpoint exactly where the Bismarck was. A Catalina flying boat from RAF Coastal Command was scrambled to confirm the findings. Through a break in the clouds, the Catalina crew spotted Bismarck racing for safe haven in northwest France. But the Admiralty was already one step ahead, having ordered Force H, which included the aircraft carrier Ark Royal, to leave its base in Gibraltar and head for the Atlantic. Although the British ships were searching in an area 130 miles from Bismarck's true position, she was still within range of aircraft. Swordfish from Ark Royal were scrambled to attack the mighty vessel. As they were only expecting to find one ship in the area, they launched their attack on the first ship they came across. Unfortunately, it was the British cruiser Sheffield, but luckily none of the torpedoes hit home. A second attack was launched. This time they found their target. 2 torpedoes struck home, one managing to seriously damage Bismarck's steering gear just as she was turning. Now she could only circle helplessly as the British fleet homed in for the kill. Her crew put up a determined fight, but it was only to be a matter of time as shell after shell struck home, reducing Bismarck to a blazing hulk. Finally, 3 torpedoes fired from the Dorsetshire sent her to the bottom of the sea. Hood had been avenged. Bismarck's sister ship, Tirpitz, never managed to fulfill her role. From the moment she was launched, the Navy and the RAF were determined that she would never put to sea. Repeated attempts were made to sink her, but she led a charmed existence until November 1944, when she was finally sunk by at least 2 12,000-pound bombs whilst in the Norwegian port of Tromsø. The Western Desert is a vast expanse of wilderness that hugs the shores of North Africa's Mediterranean coastline. There is little here to sustain life, let alone an army. And yet it was into this inhospitable wilderness that thousands of men and armour poured to fight some of the toughest battles of the Second World War. Not only did they have to fight each other, but they also had to fight the elements, soaring temperatures by day, followed by freezing nights. To add to their torment, the troops were hounded by millions of flies. Even a mild bruise could develop into a nasty, infected desert sore. Then there were the violent desert storms, the Khamsin, that could rage for days, blowing gritty sand into everything, making any movement impossible. For 3 years, the fortunes of both sides ebbed and flowed across hundreds of miles of desert. the British and her Commonwealth allies on one side, the Italians and Germans on the other. The campaigns were more akin to naval battles, in which tanks replaced ships. There was nothing else to get in the way, no civilian population or significant geographic features, just thousands of square miles of scrub and sand. By the winter of 1940, Britain and her Commonwealth allies had all but chased the Italians off the continent. But Mussolini appealed to his ally Hitler for help. In response, Hitler sent the newly created Afrika Korps under the command of General Erwin Rommel. His early attacks in the spring of 1941 resulted in stalemate. But by 1942, Rommel was sufficiently reinforced to chase the British out of Libya all the way back to within 50 miles of Cairo. The British Eighth Army set up a new defensive line at a place called El Alamein. El Alamein had been chosen as the last defensive line because it is only 80 miles from the coast in the north and to the Qattara Depression in the south, which is a great sand sea through which vehicles could not pass. But the Eighth Army had retreated from Libya in some disarray and was totally demoralized. The challenge facing its commanders was to galvanize this force in order to stop Rommel in his tracks. On July 1, 1942, Rommel attacked at El Alamein for the first time. For the next 2 weeks, he mounted repeated attacks in an attempt to annihilate what was left of the Eighth Army. But the Eighth Army held on. It was able to channel any attacks by holding 3 key positions, while the rest of the army remained as mobile as possible in order to attack the enemy's flanks as he came forward. As the Afrika Korps was repeatedly thrown back, the Eighth Army began attacking Italian positions, where it was felt morale was weak due to poor leadership and stretched supply lines. By the middle of the month, the equivalent of 2 Italian divisions had been removed from Rommel's order of battle. But poor coordination between armour and infantry meant that the Eighth Army was unable to drive home any advantages it had won. Winston Churchill, alarmed by what he perceived as a total lack of progress, flew out to Cairo to see for himself. It was a pivotal moment, and Churchill had made up his mind that the Middle East land forces needed some new blood. General Sir Harold Alexander was brought in as Commander-in-Chief for the Middle East, and General Bernard Montgomery was appointed to take command of the Eighth Army. A new era was about to begin, and the stage set for the showdown between 2 of the greatest commanders of the 20th century. Montgomery had his first taste of desert battle on July 1st, when Rommel struck again, this time at Alam Halfa. Rommel's plan was to mount a feinting frontal attack, accompanied by a forceful attack on the enemy's flanks, hitting his lightly defended rear and supply areas. But Montgomery was ready for him. By drawing Rommel in at Alam Halfa, Montgomery was able to destroy his armour by attacking it on 3 sides and from the air. The defeat of Rommel at Alam Halfa restored some of the Eighth Army's lost confidence. But there was still much to be done before Montgomery could consider mounting his first offensive. More reinforcements of men and equipment arrived from England, having made a journey that lasted some 6 to 8 weeks. New Sherman tanks arrived to replace the armour lost in the previous months. But Rommel too was busy rebuilding his forces after the setback at Alam Halfa. His supply lines were stretched across the desert and vulnerable to attack by Allied bombers. Heavy bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator attacked the ports and roads. Strike aircraft like the Bristol Beaufighter roamed the skies looking for surface vessels. The Royal Navy also engaged supply ships. In August, some 80% of Axis shipping was sunk. Once the men were ashore, they began a rigorous program of training, regardless of rank or job. If the Eighth Army was to defeat the Afrika Korps, its men would have to be at the peak of physical fitness in order to endure the tough conditions and demands that lay ahead. Rommel concentrated his strongest forces in the north and to the south, leaving the centre deliberately weak. With his confidence sky high, he returned to Berlin, where he was feted and promoted to Field Marshal. Meanwhile, at British headquarters in Cairo, Admiral Harwood, Air Marshal Tedder and General Alexander continued their planning for the forthcoming battle. A new spirit of cooperation and mutual support existed amongst the three services. In the desert, Montgomery and Air Vice Marshal Cunningham worked closely together on their detailed planning. This unity of command would make a significant contribution to the Allied success in North Africa. Montgomery planned the battle in 3 stages: the break-in, the dogfight, and then the breakout. He made sure that his aims and objectives were known and understood by everyone from the top down. Throughout the long, hot desert summer, final preparations were made. Finally, by October the 23rd, everything was as ready as it could be. Montgomery had assembled a huge army that outnumbered Rommel's by nearly 2 to 1. He also had double his medium tanks and anti-tank guns. No other commander in North Africa had enjoyed such an advantage. For the men, now in their start positions, these were tense hours to be filled in any way possible. As the sun set, tension rose. Tonight they would attack. 0 hour was to be 10 p.m. But at 9:30 p.m. there was to be an artillery barrage, the like of which had not been witnessed since the First World War. Sappers would then be sent through to begin clearing paths through the minefields, marking their routes with white tapes. At 9:30, a barrage of 882 guns announced the opening of Operation Lightfoot. The Battle of El Alamein had begun. The barrage, which could be heard in Alexandria 60 miles away, caught some sections of the German lines completely by surprise. The first phase was a feinting attack to the south in order to fool Rommel into believing that this was the main attack. But it was in the far north that the main thrust was to take place. In the weeks leading up to the attack, the battle plan had been revised following the realization that the Axis weak points lay where the Italian and German forces overlapped. It was at these points that the most intense attacks were directed. But despite the surprise, the German defences soon got themselves organised and began to mount counterattacks. Rommel ordered his panzers northwards, where the Allies had pushed forward to help his beleaguered infantry. In the days that followed, the tide of battle hung in the balance, as the Eighth Army mounted attacks up and down the enemy's line, gradually forcing him off balance. On November the 1st, the battle entered its final phase, as the Allies mounted an attack on the panzer's southern flank. Codenamed Operation Supercharge, the aim was to draw the panzers into battle and then mount a major armoured attack in the north, catching the engaged panzers off balance. The plan worked, and once again Rommel was facing defeat. Sensing disaster, and with his supply lines crippled, Rommel cabled Hitler seeking permission to disengage and withdraw. His request was denied. But as his losses mounted, an increasingly disillusioned Rommel once again requested permission to withdraw. This time, his request was granted. On November the 8th, Rommel began his withdrawal. The chase was now on, as Rommel forces began streaming westwards. But this was no headlong retreat. As Montgomery and the Eighth Army were to discover in the weeks that followed, Rommel was able to conduct a masterful withdrawal. Time and again he would meet his pursuers head-on with just enough strength to stop them before melting away into the desert. Bad weather also hampered progress, but Montgomery was not to be rushed. In Britain, El Alamein was greeted as the Great Victory. For the first time since the war began, the church bells rang in celebration. In Winston Churchill's mind, the victory marked a turning point conflict in the war. The British had begun planning the eventual liberation of Europe almost as soon as her army had been chased off continental Europe in June 1940. The entry of the United States into the war meant that Britain now had a powerful ally who was also committed to achieving an end of the war in Europe as quickly as possible. In May 1943, the proposed invasion of Western Europe was given its name, Operation Overlord, and by January 1944, a supreme commander had been appointed, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower appointed British commanders to oversee the invasion forces on land, sea and air, including General Bernard Montgomery, the victor of El Alamein, who was given command of the ground invasion forces. Although Normandy had already been chosen as the invasion area, one of Montgomery's first acts was to increase the size and scope of the invasion force. The invasion force was to consist of 5 infantry divisions, 2 American, 2 British and 1 Canadian. They were to land west to east on beaches codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno and Sword. In addition, 2 American airborne divisions, the 82nd and 101st, were to drop behind the western end of the assault area, whilst 1 British airborne division, the 6th, was to drop on objectives on the eastern end. As training intensified, the build-up of reserves of men and equipment continued to flow in from the United States. The convoy still had to run the gauntlet of the U-boat threat, even though the danger was not as great as it had been. Much of Britain became one enormous military camp. Almost the entire coastline, from the Wash to Land's End for some 10 miles inland, became strictly controlled or even no-go areas. It meant that in some villages, the civilian population was evacuated to make way for the military personnel. Large quantities of arms and explosives were parachuted into France so that when the call came, broadcast over the BBC, the resistance fighters could rise up and disrupt communications and so add further to the confusion. Meanwhile, rehearsals and training continued in England. Airborne forces were to play a major part in the early phase of the landings, landing ahead of the main invasion force by parachute and glider. Key to the success of the landings was the silencing of the artillery batteries that guarded the beaches. These positions were part of Hitler's mighty Atlantic Wall, a ring of concrete and steel that stretched from Norway to the Pyrenees. Many of these positions had massive guns that could range on targets miles out in the channel, and so could prevent the landing craft from even getting remotely near the beaches. There were also the critical routes into and out of the invasion area, along which the Germans could send reinforcements. These would have to be blocked or held until the invasion forces were ashore. Timing would be critical, as airborne troops are by necessity lightly armed. Their light weapons would be no match against tanks if the Germans were to mobilize them in time. For weeks the airborne soldiers practiced for their task. Finally, the stage was set for the greatest invasion the world had ever seen. On May 17, 1944, Eisenhower finally committed to June the 5th as the unalterable date for the invasion. All along Britain's south coast, convoys filled the roads and rail networks. All it would have taken was for 1 German reconnaissance aircraft to spot all this movement, and the secrecy would have been blown. But Allied fighters had won control of the skies, and no German aircraft ventured north. The troops were assembled into transit camps, and all communication with the outside world cut off. Such was the state of secrecy. At the beginning of June, the men began loading onto their landing craft. They had done this many times in the previous months, and even now they could not be entirely sure that this was not just another exercise. Once on board, the vessels moved out to their assembly areas, and there they waited. But once on board, the men were given their final orders. Now they knew that this time it was the real thing. Then, on the night of June the 4th, bad weather set in. The operation had to be postponed for 24 hours. Finally, on the morning of the 5th, having been assured of a break in the awful weather, Eisenhower gave the order for Operation Overlord to begin. Within hours, an armada of 500 naval vessels, including escort destroyers and battleships, 2,500 other ships, and 3,000 landing craft, set out for the Normandy coast. Eisenhower himself made a special visit to the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne to wish them good luck. These men would be among the very first to set foot in France in the early hours of D-Day. Over 800 aircraft carrying parachutists or towing gliders took off on the first stage of their hazardous missions. Meanwhile, strike aircraft began their sorties, the first of over 13,000 sorties that would be flown in support of D-Day. Their targets were the coastal batteries and roads and rail junctions in the invasion area itself. Through the night, the Armada headed across the English Channel, undetected by German radar and patrols. As daybreak began to lighten the sky, the French coastline emerged out of the gloom. Inland, the British paras and glider-borne infantry had already taken their first objectives. The bridge at Ronville, which was renamed Pegasus Bridge in honour of the achievement, had fallen easily. But Merville Battery, which threatened the British and Canadian beaches, put up more of a fight. Many of the paras were dropped miles off target into flooded country where hundreds drowned. But a scratch force was assembled, and after vicious hand-to-hand fighting, the garrison was taken. But only just in time, for the invasion force was assembling off the Normandy coast. Then, at about 6:30 in the morning of June the 6th, 1944, the first assault troops clambered down the netting into their landing craft. As they joined the growing flotilla of vessels carrying thousands of troops and armour, one can only imagine what fears played on them as they began their final journey towards the Normandy coast. For many, there was a sense of relief, for the crossing had been rough and many soldiers had been very seasick. On the British and Canadian beaches, the initial assaults went well. Opposition was quickly overcome, and by late morning, armour and men were moving inland. Recognising that armoured support was vital if an assault was to have any chance of success, the British had developed special swimming tanks. A canvas screen provided buoyancy, while the tank's engines drove two propellers. Once ashore, the screen was lowered and the tank ready to engage the enemy. But the British advance soon ground to a halt around Caen as German resistance began to harden. Also, the Normandy countryside favoured defence. The Norman system of surrounding fields with high hedgerows and sunken lanes meant that every farm became a fortress. For weeks, the British made little progress, although their repeated offensives had the effect of drawing in more and more German armour. By August, the German forces facing the Americans in the west were so weakened that the Americans were able to break out. The Germans now faced being completely surrounded in a pocket near Falaise to the south of Caen. Despite repeated attacks from the air and by artillery, some 240,000 men escaped between the 16th and 19th of August, albeit without their equipment. They left behind some 50,000 dead and 200,000 taken as prisoners of war. For 3 hard months, the Allies had fought in Normandy, but within a week they were greeted as the liberators of Paris. The fall of Paris and the link-up with the forces pushing up from the south of France meant that the Allies could now surge eastwards like a giant tidal wave. Following the liberation of Paris, the Allies advanced north. By September the 3rd, they had reached Brussels. But supply lines were now so elongated that Eisenhower ordered a halt to the rapid advance for 3 days so that the logistics tail could catch up. Ahead of them lay 3 major rivers, the Maas, Waal and Lower Rhine. Montgomery had devised a plan which centered on the use of airborne forces, seizing and holding the bridges that crossed these rivers. At the same time, 30 Corps was to push northwards to link up with the airborne troops. If the operation was a success, then Germany would be open to an attack on its flank. It was just conceivable that the war could be over by Christmas. The American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were given the task of capturing the bridges at Eindhoven and Nijmegen, while the British 1st Airborne Division and Polish Parachute Brigade were given the task of capturing the northernmost bridge at Arnhem. On the 17th of September 1944, Operation Market Garden began as gliders and heavily laden transports lumbered into the air. The American airborne divisions managed to secure their objectives without too much difficulty, but the British part of the operation soon ran into problems. Their landing zones were some miles away from the objective, and by sheer bad luck, 2 panzer divisions were in the area for refitting following their mauling in Normandy. As had happened many times over the previous months, the Germans proved themselves quick to respond. Soon, the lightly armed paratroops and glider infantry were facing heavy tanks. Also, there were not enough aircraft to transport the airborne troops in one lift. As a result, a second drop had to be planned. To add to the airborne troops' problems, communications broke down, so that many of their supplies were dropped off target, straight into the enemy's hands. Further south, 30 Corps was making slow progress. The flooded plains meant that tanks had to keep to the narrow roads which ran along the tops of the raised dikes, making them easy prey. Although some of the paras found their way through to the bridge, they could not hold out for long. There was desperate house-to-house fighting as the British troops began a withdrawal back to their headquarters near the drop zone. But by the 25th of September, it was clear that they could not be relieved, and so they were ordered to cross the Rhine and make their escape. Of the 10,000 or so men sent to Arnhem, only 3,000 made it back. 1,200 were killed, the rest taken as prisoners of war. It was not until the following spring that the Allies were able to make their final assault across the Rhine. On the 23rd of March 1945, 12 and 30 Corps crossed the Rhine at Wesel, while 6th Airborne and 17th US Airborne Divisions dropped on high ground on the east bank of the river. This time, Operation Varsity was a success, as the 2 forces were able to quickly link up. Although the war was as good as over, there were still plenty of pockets of resistance, usually manned by fanatical SS troops. But they could not halt the inevitable tide. On the 4th of May 1945, Montgomery took the surrender of all German forces in Holland, Denmark and northwest Germany. The next day, at 0800 hours, the fighting was finally